A morning interrupted. The sunlight reflected off the sleek black sedan as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the courthouse parking lot. It was a warm, vibrant morning in Greenville, South Carolina, but the weight in Kendrick's chest dulled the brightness. Today wasn't supposed to be complicated. The task ahead was straightforward: challenge an erroneous property tax adjustment on the house his late grandmother had left him. It was a simple, personal matter, worlds apart from his usual workload as a federal prosecutor. The house held deep significance for Kendrick. It was the anchor of his childhood, a sanctuary of warmth and wisdom where his grandmother had taught him the values that guided his life. After her passing, he made it a point to maintain the property as she had, a quiet tribute to her legacy. But the city's sudden decision to raise the property taxes on the house without explanation felt like an affront. Kendrick had spent weeks gathering evidence to dispute the adjustment, years of consistent tax records, assessments, and even photographs documenting the property's condition. He was confident in his case. An unforeseen delay. The morning, however, had not gone as planned. A call from his office had come through just as Kendrick was heading out the door. His team was dealing with a last-minute motion in a high-profile human trafficking case. Though the motion itself wasn't urgent, the situation demanded his immediate attention. Kendrick couldn't ignore it, even if it meant risking his carefully planned schedule. By the time he resolved the issue and hit the road, the clock was working against him. He pulled into the courthouse parking lot at 8:42 a.m., giving himself barely enough time to locate the courtroom and prepare his materials. A tense walk to the courtroom. The courthouse was a stark contrast to the federal buildings where Kendrick usually worked. Municipal courtrooms had a way of feeling less grand, more utilitarian. The walls were painted a dull beige, the chairs were scratched and worn, and the faint smell of coffee and old paper lingered in the air. As Kendrick strode down the narrow hallway, he noticed people bustling around him, some clutching stacks of papers, others whispering nervously. It was a mosaic of minor disputes, traffic violations, and property concerns. His crisp navy suit and leather briefcase made him stand out in this setting, but he didn't let it bother him. Room 204, Judge Charles Whitman. The brass nameplate glinted in the hallway's fluorescent light. Kendrick adjusted his tie and entered the room and its judge. The courtroom was already buzzing with quiet activity. Kendrick scanned the room, noting the diverse crowd, young professionals, elderly homeowners, and a few lawyers like himself. He found an empty seat near the back and opened his folder, flipping through his meticulously organized documents. A hush fell over the room as Judge Whitman entered. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp blue eyes and a shock of silver hair. His reputation preceded him, a strict enforcer of courtroom decorum with a low tolerance for perceived inefficiency. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Kendrick stood with the others, his posture straight and composed. The judge surveyed the room with a piercing gaze that made everyone shift uneasily in their seats. As Judge Whitman began calling cases, Kendrick watched closely. The judge's tone was crisp and detached, his ruling swift. A man in a suit arrived late, slipping into a seat unnoticed. A young woman followed shortly after, her casual attire suggesting she wasn't a lawyer. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Kendrick's case called. At 9:15 a.m., Kendrick's name echoed through the room. He stood, his every movement measured, and approached the podium. His polished demeanor drew a few curious glances from the other attendees. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman said sharply, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The words hit harder than Kendrick expected. He glanced at the clock. He wasn't technically late, his case was being called right on time. "Your Honor, I apologize if there was any confusion. I was attending to urgent federal matters earlier this morning." Judge Whitman's eyes narrowed. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," he said. "This court operates on order and respect. If you cannot adhere to that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Kendrick felt the room's collective attention zero in on him. He maintained his composure, nodding politely. "Understood, Your Honor. I assure you I'm prepared to proceed with my case." But the judge wasn't finished. "First, there's the matter of contempt. Your tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The announcement was met with a wave of murmurs from the audience. Kendrick's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he didn't let his expression betray his thoughts. "Your Honor, may I explain the circumstances?" The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." A moment of clarity. As Kendrick returned to his seat, his mind raced. The fine wasn't just excessive, it was punitive. He glanced around the room, observing the reactions of others. The man who had arrived late before him looked on with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. The young woman scrolled through her phone, entirely unbothered. It was impossible to ignore the disparity. Others had been late, yet none had been reprimanded. The fine wasn't just about tardiness, it was a message. Kendrick opened his folder, but his focus was no longer on the property tax documents. He began jotting notes on a legal pad, his mind shifting into analytical mode. This wasn't just about him. It was about fairness, about justice. The older black man seated 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief, knowing glance. It was a quiet moment of solidarity, a reminder that this wasn't an isolated incident. As the judge continued with the morning docket, Kendrick sat back, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The turning point. Kendrick's decision was clear, this wasn't just about correcting a tax error or challenging an unfair fine. This was about standing up to a system that operated on unspoken biases. He wasn't just a lawyer defending his case, he was a man determined to shine a light on injustice, even in the smallest of courtrooms. And as the judge called the next case, Kendrick knew he was ready for whatever came next. This was just the beginning. Beneath the surface. Kendrick sat in the back row, his mind a turbulent storm of thoughts as the courtroom buzzed around him. The sting of Judge Whitman's fine still lingered, but it wasn't the monetary penalty that gnawed at him. It was the unmistakable double standard, the gavel of injustice disguised as authority. His role as a federal prosecutor had taught him how to spot prejudice, even when it cloaked itself in procedural propriety. Today, he had seen it, sharp, deliberate, and pointed in his direction. As the court session continued, Kendrick's lawyer's instinct kicked in. He observed Judge Whitman with a critical eye, scrutinizing every interaction. The patterns were subtle but undeniable. The judge addressed some defendants with indifference, others with leniency. Yet, when it came to Kendrick, his tone had been laced with something different, suspicion, even disdain. Kendrick flipped open his legal pad and began jotting down his observations. Each latecomer, each ruling, each inconsistency, it all went onto the page. He wasn't just documenting, he was building a case. His training demanded it. Every detail mattered. A history of injustice. Kendrick couldn't ignore the nagging question, was this an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern? He had encountered similar dynamics before, both in his personal life and his career. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood, he had seen how systems could operate differently depending on who you were and where you came from. Even as a federal prosecutor, a position of prestige and authority, Kendrick wasn't immune to prejudice. He had faced skepticism from colleagues, subtle dismissals from opposing counsel, and even outright hostility in certain courtrooms. But this felt different. This wasn't a battle over a case or a defendant's rights, this was personal. The courtroom seemed to embody a microcosm of the inequities he had spent his career fighting against. And now, he was the one under scrutiny. The case at hand. Kendrick refocused on the matter that had brought him here, the property tax adjustment. The house his grandmother had left him wasn't just a structure of brick and mortar, it was a cornerstone of his identity. When Kendrick was a child, the house had been a sanctuary. He had spent countless afternoons on its porch, listening to his grandmother's stories about perseverance and resilience. She had been a woman of quiet strength, raising her family in the face of adversity and teaching Kendrick to dream beyond his circumstances. Her passing had been a profound loss, but the house remained a tangible link to her memory. It was a place he could visit to feel her presence, to ground himself in the values she had instilled. When the city's property tax notice arrived, Kendrick initially thought it was a mistake. A 30% increase was inexplicable, especially given the house's modest value and consistent tax history. But as he dug deeper, he discovered troubling inconsistencies in the city's assessment practices. It wasn't just his property that had been targeted. Other homes in historically black neighborhoods had seen similar unexplained hikes. Kendrick suspected gentrification pressures were at play, a quiet push to displace long-standing residents in favor of wealthier newcomers. He had resolved to fight it, not just for himself, but for his community. The turning tide. The courtroom proceedings dragged on, but Kendrick's focus never wavered. He watched as Judge Whitman handed down rulings with a mechanical efficiency that bordered on indifference. Traffic tickets, landlord disputes, and small claims blurred together in a monotonous rhythm. Kendrick's thoughts drifted to his strategy. He had all the evidence he needed to prove his case: tax records, photographs, and official correspondence. But after his earlier encounter with Judge Whitman, he realized that evidence alone might not be enough. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a test of credibility, of who would be believed in the face of unequal treatment. The judge's bias had been clear, but Kendrick knew better than to address it directly, at least not yet. Confrontation in a courtroom could be a double-edged sword, especially when dealing with a figure like Whitman, whose authority loomed large. Still, Kendrick couldn't let the moment pass without action. He decided to approach the situation with precision, using the tools of his trade to expose the truth without escalating the tension unnecessarily. Solidarity in the shadows. As Kendrick reviewed his notes, he became increasingly aware of the subtle glances being cast his way. Other attendees in the courtroom were watching him, not with disdain, but with quiet respect. The older black man who had turned earlier now shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting Kendrick's again. There was a shared understanding in that gaze, a recognition of a shared struggle. It was a small gesture, but it bolstered Kendrick's resolve. Moments like this reminded Kendrick why he had pursued a career in law. He wasn't just representing himself, he was standing up for those who couldn't always speak for themselves. A calculated approach. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway. Kendrick lingered near a bench, flipping through his documents one last time. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. "Need you for a meeting later today. How's it going?" Kendrick typed back quickly, "Fine. Just dealing with something that needs to be addressed." As he hit send, the older man who had been glancing at him earlier approached cautiously. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low but steady. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. That wasn't right." Kendrick looked up, offering a polite smile. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The man hesitated before continuing. "You're a lawyer, aren't you? I can tell by the way you carry yourself." "Yes, I'm a federal prosecutor," Kendrick replied, keeping his tone professional. The man nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "Well, I hope you give that judge something to think about. People like him think they can get away with anything." Kendrick's smile tightened. "I plan to." The weight of responsibility. As the recess ended and people filtered back into the courtroom, Kendrick felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about clearing up a tax issue or paying an unfair fine. This was about confronting a system that operated on double standards, about challenging the unchecked power that allowed bias to persist. When Kendrick's case was called again, he stood with calm determination. He wasn't just another defendant in the courtroom, he was a professional armed with facts, prepared to shine a light on injustice. And as he approached the podium, he knew one thing for certain: Judge Whitman might hold the gavel, but Kendrick held the truth. The scales of justice. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Kendrick Robinson could feel it as he stood at the podium. The eyes of those seated behind him weighed heavily on his back, some curious, some watchful, and a few silently willing him to succeed. The stakes felt higher than they had at the start of this ordinary morning. This wasn't just about correcting a property tax error anymore. It was about something bigger: truth, equity, and challenging the unspoken dynamics that too often went unquestioned. Judge Whitman stared down at Kendrick from his elevated bench, his expression unreadable but his authority palpable. The gavel in his hand was not just a tool to maintain order, it was a symbol of power. Power that, in this room, had already been wielded with alarming disparity. "Mr. Robinson," the judge began, his tone clipped and formal, "you may continue presenting your case. Let us hope your arguments are more compelling than your excuses for tardiness." The slight jab didn't faze Kendrick. If anything, it fueled his resolve. "Thank you, Your Honor," Kendrick said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that silenced the murmurs in the room. He adjusted the documents on the podium, arranging them methodically, his movements deliberate. "As I was saying earlier, the property in question has been in my family for decades," Kendrick began, gesturing toward the folder before him. "The recent tax adjustment reflects a 30% increase, which is both unexplained and unsupported by the city's assessment criteria." He paused, letting his words sink in, before continuing. "Here, I have 5 years' worth of tax records for the property, which demonstrate a consistent valuation. Additionally, I've included a copy of the city's own guidelines for property reassessment, which clearly state that any significant increase must be accompanied by written notification to the property owner." Kendrick lifted one of the documents from the folder and held it up for emphasis. "I never received such a notification, Your Honor." A calculated silence. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "So you're claiming the city made an error in its assessment?" "I'm not merely claiming it, Your Honor. I have evidence to prove it." Kendrick's voice remained steady, but inside, he was acutely aware of the dynamics at play. He knew the judge wasn't scrutinizing his evidence out of impartiality, he was scrutinizing Kendrick himself. Every word, every gesture, every nuance of his presentation was under a microscope. Kendrick had seen this before: the quiet yet persistent questioning of his credibility, the unspoken challenge to prove he belonged in spaces where his qualifications should have been enough. Judge Whitman flipped through the pages Kendrick had submitted, his face betraying nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, as the judge read. Kendrick stood patiently, refusing to fidget or show any sign of unease. Finally, the judge set the papers down. "Your documentation is thorough, I'll give you that. But errors happen, Mr. Robinson. That doesn't necessarily mean there's any deliberate wrongdoing." Kendrick allowed himself a small nod. "I agree, Your Honor. Errors do happen. But when those errors disproportionately impact certain communities, it raises questions that must be addressed." Turning the lens. The words hung in the air, and Kendrick saw the flicker of discomfort cross Judge Whitman's face. It was brief, but it was there. "What exactly are you implying, Mr. Robinson?" the judge asked, his tone sharp. "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor," Kendrick replied smoothly. "I'm stating that this isn't an isolated issue. Many properties in historically black neighborhoods have seen similar unexplained tax increases. It's a pattern, one that merits closer examination." The room was utterly silent now. Even the faint rustling of papers had ceased. Kendrick's words had struck a nerve, not just with the judge but with the audience. Judge Whitman's grip on his gavel tightened, but he didn't strike it. This court is not the forum for broad accusations or policy debates. We are here to address the specifics of your case. Respectfully, Your Honor, Kendrick countered, "This court is precisely the forum to address inequity when it manifests through specific cases like mine. If we ignore the larger context, we risk perpetuating the very disparities our legal system is meant to rectify." The judge's retort. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Kendrick thought he might strike the gavel and declare his words out of order. But instead, Judge Whitman leaned forward, his piercing blue gaze fixed on Kendrick. "Be careful, Mr. Robinson," he said quietly, his voice low but no less authoritative. "You are here to argue a property tax case, not to deliver a lecture on systemic inequality." Kendrick met the judge's gaze evenly. "With respect, Your Honor, the two are not mutually exclusive. My case is a symptom of a larger issue, and it's my duty, not just as an attorney, but as a citizen, to call attention to it." A faint murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's glare. "Let's return to the matter at hand," Judge Whitman said briskly, his tone dismissive. "You've presented your evidence. I will review it and render a decision." An uneasy pause. Kendrick returned to his seat, his mind racing. He knew he had pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in this courtroom, but he had done so deliberately. He wasn't just arguing his case, he was laying the groundwork for a larger conversation. The older man who had spoken to him earlier caught his eye again, offering a subtle nod of approval. Kendrick felt a surge of quiet determination. He wasn't alone in this room, even if it felt like it at times. As the next case was called, Kendrick resumed his silent observations. The patterns of bias continued, as stark as ever. A middle-aged white man who had arrived late received no reprimand. A young white woman argued her case with visible agitation, yet the judge's tone remained calm and accommodating. The disparity was undeniable, and Kendrick wasn't the only one noticing it. Strategizing for justice. During another brief recess, Kendrick found himself approached by a woman in her 40s, her expression hesitant but resolute. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For what you said earlier. About the patterns and the neighborhoods. You're right. It's happening to all of us." Kendrick nodded, his voice warm but firm. "Thank you for saying that. It's important we don't stay silent about these things." The woman nodded quickly, then retreated into the crowd. Kendrick took a deep breath, his mind already calculating his next steps. He wasn't just going to rely on the judge to see reason, he would prepare for the possibility of an appeal. If necessary, he would escalate the matter beyond this courtroom, drawing attention to the systemic issues underlying his case. This was about more than winning a ruling. This was about using his position, his knowledge, and his voice to make a difference. As the court session resumed, Kendrick straightened his tie and squared his shoulders. He was ready for whatever came next. The fight for justice had only just begun. The echoes of justice. Kendrick sat in the back of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on Judge Whitman as the man methodically called case after case. The sounds of voices and shuffled papers faded into the background. His mind was far from the legal proceedings unfolding before him. Instead, it was preoccupied with the realization that today had become more than just a fight over a tax assessment. The weight of it was pressing on him now, much heavier than it had been when he first walked in. It wasn't just about challenging a bureaucratic mistake anymore. It was about pushing back against a system that often seemed indifferent to people like him, a system that had seen him rise from humble beginnings to become a federal prosecutor, yet still viewed him as an outsider in certain spaces. The more Kendrick thought about it, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about one judge or one case, it was about everything he had worked for, everything he stood for. And it was about a larger, unspoken narrative of inequality, of which he had become a part. As the last few cases were called, Kendrick continued to reflect on his earlier encounter with Judge Whitman. He had known the risks of speaking out, of pushing boundaries. But it had been a necessary risk. The look on the older man's face when he had nodded in approval, the brief exchange with the woman in the gallery, these were the moments Kendrick carried with him now. It wasn't just about his own voice, but the voices of everyone who had ever been silenced in a place like this. His words, though they had been met with resistance, had stirred something in the room. He had made people think. That, in itself, was a victory. The turning point. When his case was finally called again, Kendrick stood with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the day. He straightened his navy suit, adjusted his tie, and walked back to the podium, the echoes of the judge's earlier reprimand still ringing in his ears. But this time, he was ready for whatever would come next. "Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman began, his voice hard, but with an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. "You've presented your case. I will now review the documentation and determine the outcome. But let us be clear, your conduct in this courtroom has been noted." Kendrick met the judge's gaze squarely, refusing to back down. "I understand, Your Honor," he replied evenly, his voice steady. "But I also believe that it is important to acknowledge that fairness in a courtroom goes beyond just following procedures. It must include recognizing systemic issues that affect the people who appear before the court. And I believe that's what I did today." The words hung in the air. There was no immediate response from the judge. Instead, a charged silence filled the room as Kendrick held his ground. He could feel the eyes of the gallery upon him, waiting, watching. He had said what needed to be said. He wasn't sure how it would be received, but in that moment, he felt a sense of resolve that was unshakable. He had taken a stand. Judge Whitman, for his part, seemed momentarily taken aback, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed Kendrick. There was something different in his demeanor now, something that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to handle the unexpected defiance in the room. After a long pause, he finally spoke again, his voice low but authoritative. "The unseen battles." The court session resumed, but Kendrick's focus was no longer on the judge's words, nor the mundane rituals of legal proceedings. His mind had shifted entirely. While the courtroom remained a battleground for cases small and large, Kendrick's personal war had taken on a new shape, a battle for fairness, for the quiet dignity that so often slipped unnoticed in a world consumed by rules and power structures. He stood at the back of the courtroom, his gaze occasionally flickering to the judge, who was now outlining his decision. Kendrick's thoughts, however, were miles away, sifting through the larger implications of what had happened today. The judge, though seemingly unflappable and imposing, had shown cracks in his fortress. Kendrick had struck a chord. And that, above all else, was what mattered. His actions had set something in motion. Whether it was the judge's discomfort or the subtle stirrings among the audience, Kendrick knew the wheels of change had been set in motion. But even with that realization, Kendrick couldn't deny that the stakes were higher than ever. He was no longer just fighting for justice in a small, inconsequential case. He was up against something far more pervasive, biases so ingrained in society, in the systems of power, that they could never be fully erased with a single speech or a pointed question. Yet, Kendrick understood something vital in that moment. The fight for fairness didn't need to be grand or heroic in every instance. Sometimes, it was the quiet battles, the subtle pushes against authority, that had the most lasting effects. As Judge Whitman wrapped up the case in a terse, almost robotic fashion, Kendrick remained in his place, his stance unyielding. He had made his stand, and now, it was time to wait for the consequences. Would the judge cave under the weight of Kendrick's challenge? Or would he double down, dismissing the prosecutor as just another disobedient lawyer? There were many possible outcomes, but Kendrick knew that whatever happened, he had done more than simply advocate for his property taxes. He had disrupted the narrative of power and submission that too often defined the courtroom. A moment of clarity. The judge's ruling came swiftly, and it was delivered with little fanfare. Kendrick's tax assessment case was ruled in his favor. The discrepancy had been acknowledged, and the erroneous tax hike was adjusted. However, it was not the outcome that lingered with Kendrick, it was the journey there, the exchanges that had occurred outside of the confines of legal doctrine. The ruling, though important, was just a single chapter in a much larger story, one that Kendrick had only begun to write. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Kendrick remained seated, his hands folded before him, eyes now focused on the judge. He could feel the weight of his presence. It wasn't that Kendrick had won today, it was that he had shifted something larger than a mere legal decision. He had put a crack in the armor of complacency. Judge Whitman, who had once towered over the room as an unapproachable figure, now stood for a long moment, surveying the empty space before him. His gavel, which had so often struck with swift authority, sat untouched at the edge of his bench. It was as though the echoes of Kendrick's words had reverberated too deeply for him to return to his usual demeanor. A fleeting moment of reflection passed over his face before he turned his gaze towards Kendrick. "You were right," Judge Whitman finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter now, almost measured. "It's never as simple as we think. Sometimes we forget that." Kendrick felt a momentary sense of vindication, but it was fleeting. The battle had been won, yes, but there was so much more to be done. So many other judges, so many other rooms filled with subtle, systemic prejudice. So many people who would never be able to step up, speak out, or challenge the very systems that oppressed them. In that moment, Kendrick knew that this courtroom fight had simply been a microcosm of a larger, deeply entrenched battle for fairness and justice. "I appreciate that," Kendrick replied, his voice steady but laced with understanding. "But I think you'll agree, words don't change systems. Actions do." The judge didn't respond immediately, but his thoughtful silence spoke volumes. For the first time in the course of their interaction, Kendrick saw the man before him not as a distant figure of authority but as someone who was beginning to grasp the weight of his own role in upholding systems of justice. Kendrick stood from his seat, adjusting his suit and collecting his case files. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll take my leave now." The judge nodded but said nothing more. As Kendrick walked toward the exit, a quiet sense of accomplishment settled in his chest. This wasn't the grand victory of changing a corrupt system overnight, but it was a step, a crucial one. A deeper realization. Back outside the courthouse, Kendrick stood beneath the warmth of the late morning sun, his hands pressed into his pockets. The world beyond the courthouse was busy, people moving hurriedly down the sidewalks, the low hum of cars as they navigated the streets, but Kendrick felt strangely detached from it all. It was as though the routine bustle of life had lost its usual grip on him. He had spent so many years of his life in pursuit of legal victories, always focused on the small wins, the tactical advantages. But now, everything had shifted. Today had proven something fundamental. The law was not merely a set of rules and procedures, it was a living, breathing force that had to be wrestled with, not just followed. He glanced up at the sky, the towering clouds stretching lazily overhead. It was a beautiful day, but Kendrick felt a bittersweet edge to it, as though the warmth of the sun couldn't fully reach the deeper parts of him. There was still so much to confront, so many issues that needed to be addressed. So many wrongs that had been woven into the fabric of the system, some so deeply embedded that they were hardly ever noticed. As Kendrick walked down the steps of the courthouse and made his way back to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it, surprised to see a text from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Robinson," the message began. "I was in the courtroom today. I just wanted to thank you for what you did. I've been trying to get my case heard for years, but the system never listens. After hearing you speak up, I'm going to try again." Kendrick's fingers hovered over the screen as he read the words. A part of him wanted to dismiss it as a fluke, a random moment of gratitude, but something inside him stirred. This was what it was all about, the quiet ripple effects of taking a stand. This was how change began. Not with a grand gesture, but with one voice, one person who refused to stay silent. Kendrick's resolve deepened in that moment. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had been pushed to the margins, everyone who had been made to feel invisible or powerless in a system that was supposed to serve them. He typed a quick reply, his fingers steady despite the surge of emotion he felt. "Thank you for your kind words. The fight is long, but it's always worth it. Keep pushing." He hit send and then slipped the phone back into his pocket, the message a reminder of the journey ahead. Kendrick wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. There were battles yet to be won, challenges yet to be faced. But he knew now that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. And each victory, no matter how quiet, carried the weight of something larger. With a deep breath, Kendrick Robinson climbed into his car and drove off, the road ahead stretching out before him, wide and uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready for whatever came next. The ripple of change. The drive back to his office was almost meditative for Kendrick. The streets of Greenville were alive with the hum of everyday life, cars weaving in and out of traffic, pedestrians hurrying along, the soft rustling of trees swaying in the breeze. Yet in Kendrick's mind, the world felt quieter. Today's events had stirred something deep within him, something that wasn't easy to shake off. The reverberations of his actions in that courthouse still echoed in his mind. Every word he had spoken, every challenge he had made against Judge Whitman's bias, felt like a small victory in the larger battle for equality, fairness, and justice. And yet, there was a part of him that couldn't quite settle. It wasn't enough just to make a statement. Kendrick knew that real change required more, much more. As he parked his car in front of the U.S. Attorney's office, Kendrick glanced up at the towering building. His office was nestled in the heart of the city, a place where the highest-profile cases in the nation were often handled. He had spent years in this world of complex legal arguments, high-profile prosecutions, and powerful adversaries. But the courthouse incident today had shifted his perspective. He had realized something profound in that courtroom: the law wasn't just a series of statutes and rules. It was a force, something that shaped people's lives, for better or worse. And if the law was going to change, it wouldn't be from the top down. It had to start from the ground up, with people willing to confront the subtle injustices hidden in plain sight. Kendrick didn't head straight to his office. Instead, he made his way to the small conference room where his team often gathered. It was early afternoon, and his colleagues were busy with various cases, typing away at their computers, discussing strategy over the phone, or reading through legal briefs. But Kendrick wasn't in the mood for business as usual. He knew that the time had come for a larger conversation. A conversation about fairness, equality, and how the law was being applied, or more accurately, how it wasn't. He knocked lightly on the door before entering. A few heads turned. His team, 2 assistant U.S. attorneys and a handful of support staff, looked up at him in surprise, their eyes momentarily widening at his somber expression. "Everyone, gather around," Kendrick said, his voice calm but firm. There was a ripple of curiosity among his team as they pushed back their chairs, setting aside their papers and phones. Kendrick didn't waste any time. He had made up his mind. This was not just a conversation about the work they were doing, it was a challenge to the very system they were part of. A system that had failed countless people over the years, a system that Kendrick had only recently started to truly understand. "Today, I went to court for a case that had nothing to do with what we usually handle," Kendrick began, pacing slowly across the room. "It was about property taxes, something small, something personal to me. But what happened there was something much bigger than tax law. I was fined for being late, a fine that was completely disproportionate for what had happened. But here's the thing, it wasn't about being late. It was about something deeper. Something that's been present in the system for a long time." His team exchanged glances, sensing that something was different today. Kendrick had never spoken like this before. "That judge was unfair," Kendrick continued. "He was biased. And he imposed a fine on me for no other reason than my race, my background, my position in society. He didn't fine the others who were late. He didn't give them the same treatment. And the reason is simple, it's because people like me, black men in positions of power, challenge the status quo. We make people uncomfortable. Kendrick paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. He could see that his colleagues were processing the gravity of what he was saying. They had always seen Kendrick as the picture of professionalism, polished, capable, always in control. But now, they were seeing a different side of him, a side that was frustrated, tired, and hungry for change. "I'm not asking for pity," Kendrick went on, his voice steady but laced with intensity. "I'm not even asking for justice in this moment. What I'm asking for is awareness. I'm asking for all of us to understand that the law, as it is, doesn't always serve justice. It serves the system. And if we're going to change that, if we're going to make things better, we have to be willing to confront it." One of his colleagues, a young assistant named Sarah, spoke up. "But Kendrick, what can we really do? I mean, we're part of the system too. We've all seen cases where the law didn't seem fair. What difference can we make?" Kendrick turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. "That's the exact problem. Everyone thinks the system is too big to change. That we're just a cog in the wheel. But if we all think that way, nothing ever changes. We have to be willing to challenge it. To call out the biases, the inequities, the small injustices that happen every day. It won't be easy. It might not be popular. But it's necessary." A heavy silence filled the room as everyone absorbed Kendrick's words. He could feel the tension, the hesitation in the air. But he wasn't looking for easy answers. He was looking for the spark of something more. "I know what you're all thinking," Kendrick said, his voice softening for a moment. "This is a tough road. But I've learned something today. It's not enough to simply win cases. It's not enough to just follow the rules. We have to make sure that the rules are fair in the first place." There was a long pause as Kendrick's words hung in the air. Then, another colleague, Marcus, a seasoned prosecutor with years of experience, spoke up. "What you're saying, it's not just about one case, is it?" Kendrick met Marcus's eyes. "No, it's not. It's about everything. About every person who has ever been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated by the system. We're in a position to make a difference. But we have to be willing to do more than just follow orders. We have to make sure that the system we're a part of is actually working for everyone." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. We all have a role to play. Maybe it's time we start thinking about how we can change things, even if it's one small step at a time." Kendrick's eyes lit up as he looked around the room. There it was, the beginning of something. His team, his colleagues, were beginning to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one case. It was about a larger mission. A mission to make the law truly just for all people, not just those in positions of power or privilege. "We're going to need to rethink how we approach every case from now on," Kendrick said. "It's not enough to just win cases. We have to think about who is being harmed and how we can prevent that harm. We have to hold the system accountable, even when it's uncomfortable." There was a newfound sense of unity in the room as Kendrick's colleagues nodded in agreement. They didn't know where this journey would lead, but they knew one thing for certain: things were going to change. They were going to change. The long road ahead. As Kendrick left the conference room and made his way back to his office, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. Today had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who had been part of that courtroom encounter. His actions had planted a seed, and now it was beginning to grow. There were many battles yet to be fought, and Kendrick knew that the road ahead would be long. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But today had shown him that change was possible. He had seen it in the eyes of his colleagues, in the quiet resolve that had replaced their uncertainty. The system might be slow to change, but Kendrick had learned that real power didn't come from status, titles, or accolades. It came from courage. Courage to stand up, to speak out, and to fight for something greater than oneself. Kendrick Robinson wasn't done yet. In fact, he was just getting started. And as he sat down at his desk and prepared for the cases that lay ahead, he knew that each decision, each challenge, would bring him one step closer to the world he wanted to build. A world where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right for all.